Today, we're going to talk about the satanic cult known as the Ripper Crew. But before we get started, welcome to True Crime with Maneater. If you love all things true crime, including missing person cases, cold cases, and just the strange happenings of the world, you've come to the right place. Be sure to subscribe and turn on alerts so you never miss a video upload. Let's get started. On May 15th, 1982, Lorraine Borowski was up early and getting ready for work. She was a 21-year-old who was working as a secretary for a real estate agency. Lorraine's workplace was only a short distance away from her apartment, so she slipped on her heels. She grabbed her keys and the other things she needed for work. She stepped out, locked her door, and began her walk. And just as she was approaching the office and going to unlock the door, she was suddenly met by hands grabbing her from behind and pulling her. And as these hands are grabbing her and moving her away from the door, she's struggling and she's fighting. Her shoes fall off. Her stuff is spewed everywhere. Her keys, her purse, everything she had was just all over the place. She was dragged to a van, thrown in, and then the van sped away. Unfortunately, the people that were driving that van had some serious dark intentions that day. They drove to a nearby motel where they sexually assaulted and murdered Lorraine. Of course, police were called when everybody got to work and realized Lorraine wasn't there, but her shoes were scattered, her cosmetics, her keys, everything was scattered on the sidewalk and the ground. And police obviously didn't believe that she just went missing. She was a very responsible 21-year-old. She loved her job. She loved her friends. She had a really good thing going for her. And when police arrived and seen all of her stuff spewed everywhere, they had a really bad feeling that something terrible had happened. And unfortunately, 5 months later, her body was found. And this pattern would continue. And it would leave police dumbfounded. They soon realized they were dealing with a serial murderer, or in this case, serial murderers. On May 23rd, 1981, Linda Sutton, a 28-year-old woman, was found in a field in Villa Park, Illinois. She had been missing for 10 days at that point. And the crime scene was really graphic. Not only was the body mutilated, but her breasts had been amputated. Linda had been the cult's first victim. And they continued these attacks on women. On May 29th of the same year, they abducted another woman from Hanover Park, and her body was also not found for 4 months. And 2 weeks after they abducted that woman, they actually abducted another woman. They handcuffed her to the van. They slashed at her chest, presumably in an attempt to remove her breasts, and then threw her out of the van still alive. Of course, this woman went directly to the police, but unfortunately, she didn't get a good look at her attackers, and really they didn't have any new leads. And then 2 months later, on August 28th, 1982, Sandra Delaware was found on the bank of the Chicago River. She had been stabbed, strangled, and her left breast had been amputated. On September 8th, a 31-year-old named Rose Davis was found in an alley, and she had suffered almost identical wounds to the other victims. She had been slashed and mutilated and had her breast amputated. By now, police know they're dealing with a serial killer. And of course, this is terrifying women in the Chicago area. They don't know who this person is. They don't know why they're attacking women. And then on October 6, 1982, the gang would shoot a 28-year-old drug dealer and his 18-year-old friend at a phone booth in a drive-by shooting, which is a completely different MO than what they had previously been doing. One of them survived, but the other unfortunately didn't, and that was the one and only male victim that the gang had. After this drive-by shooting, the gang would commit one final crime before being caught. On December 6th, Beverly Washington was found by a railroad track. She had severe injuries. She was stabbed, she was mutilated, and her left breast had been cut off and removed. And her right breast was severely injured from all the slashing and the attempted amputation. But Beverly survived the attack, and she was able to give not only a description of the attackers, but the van that they had used to abduct her. Police obviously now have description of these men in the van, and the first person they find, Robin Getch. So police go, they bring him in for questioning, and they soon realize they don't have any evidence, so they can't hold him, and they have to release him. So they kept investigating, and they soon realized that in 1981, he had rented a motel room with adjoining rooms for 3 other friends. So they went and they talked to the hotel manager, and the hotel manager was telling them these guys were really loud, they were throwing parties, and it seemed like they were in some sort of cult. And right away, the police knew that they had to find these other men. So they go and they find Edward Spritzer, and then they find the 2 Cocorales brothers, Andrew and Thomas Cocorales, and they begin questioning. And what Thomas begins to tell the police leaves them in complete and utter terror. Thomas would go on to confess that the gang would drive around until they found a woman who they would assume is a prostitute, or any woman that was alone and looked like an easy target for the gang. They would abduct her and they would take her back to Robin Getch's place. They called Robin's place a satanic chapel. There, they raped and tortured the women and amputated their breasts with a wire garrote. And if you don't know what a wire garrote is, it's like this really sharp wire. It can be use to cut through things like clay. It's a really, really strong wire. And that's what they use to actually amputate women's breasts, which was probably incredibly painful. And it was probably really hard and time consuming to do it that way. And I feel like they chose that very specifically to cause a lot of pain and to torture these women. And after they torturously severed the breasts of these women, they would go on to eat the breast as some sort of cannibalistic ritual. And then Robin Getch would pleasure himself into the breast before putting them in a box as a keepsake. Kokoraleis once claimed that he saw up to at least 15 breasts in a box. Robin Getch was supposedly the leader of this satanic cult, and what's even more terrifying, he actually worked at one point for John Wayne Gacy. John Wayne Gacy was a terrifying serial killer that raped, tortured, and murdered at least 33 young men and boys. And what's even creepier about him is he liked to dress up as clowns, and he was always around children, and people really never suspected him of being a serial killer. He got away with it for quite some time. He also stuffed the bodies under his house in a crawl space. So the fact that Robin Getch actually worked for John Wayne Gacy kind of makes you feel like he may have gotten some inspiration after the arrest of John Wayne Gacy. Of course, police are listening to this terrifying and disturbing case of not only kidnapping, torture, rape, murder, but also cannibalism. So not only did these men just do horrific acts, they literally ate the bodies of these murdered women. So the police arrest all 4 of these men and they go to trial. Edward Spritzer and Andrew Kokoraleis were sentenced to death, and Andrew was actually executed by lethal injection in 1982 for the strangulation and murder of Lorraine Borowski. So Thomas actually received life imprisonment for the murder of Lorraine Borowski. Edward actually had his death row sentence commuted to life imprisonment, so Andrew was actually only one of the 4 who was sentenced to death, but also received the death penalty. He did die by lethal injection. And Robin Getch, who is said to be the leader of this satanic cult, they really couldn't tack on too much evidence to prove that he was the ringleader and he did commit all these murders. Robin Getch eventually would receive life imprisonment. The crew was suspected of at least 18 disappearances of women in the Chicago area, although police feel like that number was significantly higher. So Robin, Edward, and Thomas actually received life sentences for their crimes, while Andrew received the death penalty and was obviously executed by lethal injection. And many people are wondering, why did this happen? How do 4 individuals come together and create this horrific kind of cult that abducts and murders and tortures women and cannibalizes them? How does that even cross people's minds, really? And Robin Getch claims that he is innocent. He did not commit any murders or rapes or anything of that nature. And Robin Getch was the only one not charged with murder. But the other members of the crew said that Robin Getch planned all this, that he was the ringleader and that they followed whatever he did. They even gave really graphic and horrific details about the crimes he committed. And by then, many women that Robin Getch had encountered had come forward and told the police how terrible of a person he was, that they didn't doubt he was murdering and torturing these women because he committed horrific acts on them. So he was charged with kidnapping, rape, and attempted manslaughter. And he is still trying to get DNA testing to try to clear his name. And despite eyewitness testimony, there really is no other evidence to prove that Robin Getch was the ringleader, that he committed any of these murders or anything like that. Robin Getch is actually eligible for parole in 2042. Robin was actually the oldest of all of these men. The others were obviously kind of teenagers and young adults, so their defense attorneys argued that obviously they were lonely, that they had been followers, and that they really just kind of went along with things, that they weren't smart enough to just be like, no, this is wrong. And Andrew's last words were to the Borowski family. He said, "I am truly sorry for your loss. I mean this sincerely." He then cited verses from the Bible and added, "Repent ye, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand." And then he was executed. So Thomas Kokoraleis, although he was convicted because of his confessions, he received a life sentence. But on appeal, the rape conviction was actually overturned, and he won a new trial in that murder case. But instead of going through a lengthy trial, Thomas actually pleaded guilty in exchange for a 70-year sentence. And what's horrifying is on March 29th, 2019, Thomas Kokoraleis was released from prison. And Thomas was actually released incredibly early. He did not complete his sentence. He was paroled. He is a free man today. And in an interview, he went on to say that people think he's a monster, but he's not a monster.
Everybody thinks I'm a monster. I'm much calmer now. I'm nicer, not mean. I just have a bad attitude.
But what he doesn't want to do, ever, he says, is talk to the victims' families.
I don't want to talk to them.
You don't want to talk to
No,
there's
ma'am.
nothing that you want to say to that family?
No, I just want to say that I feel for them. I feel sorry for them. And I'm praying for him.
And really, at the time of his arrest, he didn't have any criminal history. He was a painter, and he was kind of described as having, quote, a borderline range of intellect with an IQ of 75. And an average IQ score is between 85 and 115. So Thomas is a free man. He lives in a ministry currently, and apparently he did really well in prison. He found religion. He learned to apparently be a human being that doesn't torture other human beings, and then was released. I find that decision completely asinine. He did commit these crimes. He did have a part in torturing and killing and raping women and cannibalizing them, and he should be in prison for the rest of his life. It's sickening that he is not. And I don't feel like justice was done for the families who lost their children to these men. And then in March of 1999, Robin Getch's 18-year-old son David would go on to commit murder with two of his friends. So it seems like the pattern is kind of repeating itself there. So the other defendants, Edward and Robin, have actually exhausted their appeals and will hopefully die in prison. And apparently the psychologists and psychiatrists that have actually analyzed Thomas while he was in prison say that he was not a sexually motivated predator and he was not sexually violent, which I am flabbergasted by because that was what these crimes were completely about. They portray him kind of as this like helpless follower with a really low IQ who didn't know what he was doing. But police and investigators are furious by this. Thomas Cucurallis admitted in extreme detail and tape recorded interviews what had happened during these murders, but he denies being present at those, and he said that police actually fed him details so that he knew what to say. And police would go on to say he's not smart enough to memorize a script. Even if we gave him one, he wouldn't know how to memorize it and then recite it back to us. So there's kind of a lot of controversy surrounding Thomas, whether or not he participated and was an active member, or whether police kind of fed him all this stuff to convict all four men. I don't think we'll ever know, really. It is important to know that Andrew and Edward actually never mentioned Thomas in their confessions. I don't know if this was done purposely or if he had very little role, so that's something to consider. And Robin Getch was the only member of that four-man cult that did not confess. And they basically said that these other people were nobodies that Getch really kind of just took in and manipulated. Lori Ann Borowski's mother, who is now 83, is devastated by the news of Thomas getting released. And in the 5 months that her daughter was missing, she'd actually carry around a sheet while she looked for her daughter. She said that if she came across the body, or during the search parties they came across the body, she wanted to be able to give her daughter dignity. She wanted to obviously be able to cover her and give her dignity. And that is just such a heartbreaking statement to hear. Thomas actually has two other brothers who live in an apartment together, but their landlord made it clear that Thomas was not allowed to stay there, that he was a murderer, and they were not going to allow it. And the brothers were actually kind of frustrated by this. He insisted his brother wasn't dangerous, and he went on to say, "My brother would never hurt no one. He's not the kind of person that would turn violent. He got mixed up with the wrong people. I'm just praying for him so he can find a place to live and doesn't end up sleeping on the street." Obviously, Thomas has to be registered as a sex offender because his crimes were sexually motivated, but he won't be subject to certain regulations that a lot of sex offenders have, like boundary restrictions near parks and schools and daycare facilities. And when Thomas was arrested, he was a 22-year-old painter who hadn't had a criminal record. Psychologists claim he was basically just above mentally impaired because of his IQ, and his former attorney said that he was a follower and a people pleaser, and that it isn't really surprising that he ended up where he ended up. And really, when you look at the crimes of the Ripper crew, it's really hard to fathom that this man is out on the streets. They tortured, they murdered, they raped, they cannibalized, they cut off breasts. Everything they did was just horrific on such a large scale. So the community is very upset about his release. They don't want Thomas in their community, and I don't blame them for a second. And really, the police don't know how many victims they had. A lot of the bodies have not been recovered. And because they were high on drugs and were drinking alcohol, a lot of the times the three of them couldn't remember where they did dump the victims' bodies. And years later, the sheriff that actually witnessed Andrew's execution and is now long retired went on to say that he didn't have strong feelings feelings about Thomas's release, but if Robin Getch gets released anytime soon, you would be incredibly worried, and that would be a whole different thing. He said that Robin Getch made Charles Manson look like a Boy Scout, and that says a lot about the things we don't know in those police tapes. We know a lot about the viciousness of the crimes, but there's a lot of details the police haven't shared, a lot of horrific acts and things like that, that will probably never be shared because of how terrible they were. And that leaves me with absolute chills. That's it for today, guys. If you like this video or any other video on my channel, be sure to subscribe and turn on alerts so you never miss a video upload. See you next time.